Now today I wanted to talk about coral reefs, which I've always been very fascinated by. I find oceanic life in general very interesting. And of course, anyone who knows anything about coral reefs will know that they're currently under a lot of threat, mostly because of global climate change. These reefs, which are very sensitive to temperature, are losing a lot of their aquatic life, and as a result, a lot of the ocean's biodiversity is disappearing. Now, there was a study that came out of the Wildlife Conservatory Society. The lead author was Sarah Hughes, and what it looked at was how countries are affected by their coral reefs. It looked at 27 ones in particular, and what it found was that these countries, the ones that were lower developed and slow to adapt, as ones that were highly developed and high to adapt, but still very sensitive to changes in their coral reefs, would be most negatively affected by the loss of the coral reef. Now, a lot of people know, of course, there's a lot of beautiful wildlife there, and it should be maintained for that reason alone. But another factor a lot of people don't take into consideration is that a lot of these countries, such as Indonesia and Liberia, rely on the fish in this these coral reefs to survive. They are one of the only sources of protein for these nations, and if they lose those coral reefs, they'll lose a valuable source of protein, and the overall nutritional diet of these folks will deteriorate. And the study basically recommends that they plant beans, get chickens and other sort of minimal space livestock, but really it's sort of a solution to a problem that we don't really have a solution to, unfortunately, aside from lowering emissions and hoping that maybe we're in time to stop climate change to the point where the reefs won't be too negatively affected. However, I also wanted to share some good news for a change when it comes to coral reefs, and that's in Australia. They've recently started using these remote operated vehicles to survey deep water coral reefs. Now, these reefs are about 30 to 120 meters below the ocean's surface, and typically we've only explored reefs at about 30 meters below the ocean's surface. That's because they're very delicate and very fragile. So typically you need a scuba diver to go in, and it's very hard to scuba below 30 meters. And we had about 20 samples or so from these reefs. And thanks to these remote operated vehicles, we've increased the number of samples from these reefs up to 10,000. So 20 to 10,000, huge increase. That's because they're able to survey the areas without causing too much damage. And also we're getting better at deep sea diving, essentially, without the use of submarines and other sort of submersibles. And what we found that's really interesting is not just new corals, of course that's always going to be interesting, but also corals that we typically find higher up. So these corals that live 30 meters and higher under the ocean's surface are found to live in further depths below, which means that it's quite possible that we'll be able to transplant some of these reefs. And I don't mean just tearing them up from one place and putting them in another. That would just be moving the problem, but rather sort of breeding them and transferring them over. It takes a long time to describe how corals reproduce, but essentially it's kind of gross. They spray this, they release eggs and then release kind of coral semen. Yeah, it'll make you not want to go in the ocean near a coral reef during mating season, but nonetheless, it's a really fast way to reproduce. It just takes them a very long time to grow back. The only question is, can we get the water to be an adequate temperature? It's an open question, but nonetheless, it's great to know that we have this reserve of coral reef, and finally some good news for a change about coral reefs.
Now, to leave you with a few interesting facts about coral life, they are made up of polyps, which are very small organisms. They're about the size of a teacup. However, they live from 2 to several hundred years, so long as they're in a stable environment, they can live for a very long time. They're pretty much all classified as endangered, and what's really interesting is that if you find coral reef fossils, as many scientists have, you can construct a chronology of prehistoric climate. So essentially, what we know about prehistoric climate is in part, based on some of these coral growth patterns we have. And if you're wondering how important they are to the ocean at large, 25% of all marine creatures are supported by coral reefs. And scientists are estimating that within the next 30 years or so, we could lose up to 30% of